We all want to improve our crocheting and knitting skills, and sometimes it feels so easy and we're bouncing from one new skill to the next, but then there are the times that we feel stalled and we need some new inspiration. And today I'm sharing my 10 rules that have helped me to become a better crocheter and knitter. We're going to start with rule number 10, and then we're going to work our way all the way up to rule number 1, which is the most important one. I don't want you to miss it. But rule number 10 is to always be learning a new skill. This is a fundamental rule that I live by. Learning a new skill definitely adds to my knowledge base, but it also gets me really excited about crocheting and knitting. There are definitely those seasons when I need a project that is a little bit easier and I don't want to concentrate so hard, but when I'm ready to learn something new, it energizes me and gets me so excited. I'm currently taking a class from Knitography Farm, and if you don't know anything about Patricia and what she's doing over at Knitography Farm, let me share all of the details. I kind of geek out over this part because I love learning about traditional knitting practices. Patricia is an American who lives in Norway and has lived there for quite some time now, and she actually has a sheep farm there, and she teaches traditional Norwegian knitting. Now, I am not Norwegian, but I have fallen in love with this traditional practice. One of the great things about Patricia is that she is so full of knowledge, but she definitely challenges you to learn more. And one of the great things about taking her classes is that you always have to do a gauge swatch. And I don't know if you're like me, but gauge swatching absolutely terrifies me. I'm getting a little more comfortable with it, but I've taken 2 of her classes previously, her stranded knitting class, which is sort of her foundational class for learning the techniques of traditional Norwegian knitting, and I also did her Selbu sock class. And the great thing about Norwegian knitting is that you always swatch with purpose. That's what Patricia says. So for the Selbu sock class, we made a little mug rug to check our gauge because you definitely need socks that fit. This new class that I'm taking is the kofta class, and it is what we in America would call a cardigan, and it is color work, and it is absolutely stunning. I cannot wait to get started, but our gauge swatch that we're working on are wrist warmers. I'm not gonna lie, I'm a little nervous about it, and Patricia is really pushing us to understand gauge, and that is just a topic that scares the living daylights out of me. So I'm working really hard and I'm trying to focus, and it just gets me so excited to get those needles out, and it actually spills over into my crocheting as well, because something about learning a new skill is so exciting and energizing. The great thing about all of the knitography classes is that they are all online, so you can learn from anywhere in the world, and I'll leave a link for her in the description box below. Rule number 9 is that I never work on projects that I'm not excited about, and I know that that may seem a little bit selfish, but just hear me out. Nothing is worse than picking up your yarn for a project that you are not excited about. It doesn't mean that all of my projects are super complicated, because complicated doesn't equal interesting. Sometimes complicated projects are fun, and sometimes I need a repetitive, wonderful, simple project like this granny stripe blanket that I made, and the pattern is from Sandra Paul, and I've shared this blanket many times before because I love it so very much. It's called the Granny Goes Large blanket, and it is one that I was easily able to make, and it was just wonderful to pick up that yarn and get stitching. Having projects that I'm really excited about motivates me to pick them up and to finish them. If I'm not interested in it, I don't want to finish it, and I'm all about getting those projects finished. Rule number 8 is to weave my ends in right away, and you may be wondering why that has to do with making me a better crocheter and knitter. Here's why. When I weave in those ends right away, I'm more likely to finish that project in a reasonable amount of time. If I linger and I leave it to the very end, I don't want to pick it up, and I'm not motivated to get the project finished. And I know that if I finish the project, it keeps me excited, it keeps me inspired, and I want to move on to the next project. So weaving in my ends right away actually really does make me a better crocheter and knitter. Rule number 7 is to take my time at choosing the colors for my project, because in my opinion, the colors can make or break a project. I can have the cutest pattern, but if I choose the wrong color, 2 different things are going to happen. Number 1, I'm not going to be motivated to work on this project because I love working with gorgeous colors, and it doesn't mean that my colors are right and someone else's colors are wrong. Choose the colors that inspire you, because the more you're inspired, the more you're going to want to pick up that project and work with those gorgeous colors. Number 2, when I've spent hours working on a project and I don't like the final outcome, I will feel discouraged. And feeling discouraged about my crocheting and knitting does not inspire me to want to continue to crochet and knit. So making sure to spend a little extra time to choose my colors wisely helps me to become a better crocheter and knitter. Rule number 6, finish 99% of the projects I start. Notice that I didn't say 100% because there are projects that I never finish for one reason or another. Having unfinished projects makes me feel guilty and sad. I just think about all of that wasted time and money, and that does not motivate me to pick up my hook or needles. There have been projects that I have been tempted not to finish, but each and every one of them has been a valuable learning experience, especially this little bunny. I've talked about this little stinker before, and it is a little bunny rabbit designed by Jet Cat, and I will leave a link for the pattern in the description box below, but I know that a lot of patterns from Russian sellers are no longer available, and I'm not sure if this one is or not, but I will look and check for you guys. But one thing about this pattern is that it almost didn't get finished because this little technique at the very bottom around the legs, and this is where you actually start, is you work from the bottom up. And I got right about here where you join the legs together, and I could not understand what the directions were trying to tell me. There was actually a video and I could not understand it. I put this little project in timeout for a few days and I was really upset. I may have shed a tear or two, and I just thought, I'm not going to finish it. I can't do it. I let myself cool off because I tend to get a little flustered about things like this. Eventually I came back to it with a different attitude and I thought, I'm going to figure this out. I'm going to make this work. I ended up pushing through, finishing it, and it is one of my favorite projects to date. I made another one, and this one went so much easier because obviously I'd made the one before, but if I hadn't stuck this one out, if I hadn't pushed through the difficult part, I never would have learned those skills, and I know that I'm a better knitter for pushing through this project. Rule number 5, buy the right yarn for the project. Since we're all crocheters and knitters, choosing the right yarn is critical. There are so many wonderful yarns out there, but not every great yarn is good for a specific project. For example, a great yarn for amigurumi probably is not going to be great for a super drapey sweater, and vice versa. Price also makes no difference when you're trying to choose a yarn as well. Just because something costs more doesn't mean that yarn is going to work better for a project, and I had to learn that lesson the hard way. Now I take extra time when I am choosing yarns for a project, and I actually have a video for how to test yarn for amigurumi projects. So if you love crocheting toys, make sure to check out that video where I share exactly how to test those yarns so that you can choose the right yarn for your amigurumi projects. Rule number 4, find other crocheters and knitters that inspire me. Finding inspiration, whether it is in real life or online, is such a great motivator. Number 1, I find patterns that I never would have found before, and that always gets me excited and inspired to grab my hook, my needles, and my yarn. Second, I find so much good information and inspiration from other makers. I learn new techniques, I learn new skills, and I find myself being so excited to work on a new project because I'm seeing this wonderful inspiration from other makers around the world. Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Pinterest, these are all great ways to find inspiration. But if we're not careful, it can lead to a very bad habit, which we're going to talk about in rule number 1, which is coming up very soon. Rule number 3 is to have the right tools for the job. There is nothing more frustrating than trying to crochet or knit a project and not having the right tools. I used to be the kind of person that tried to get away with not having all of the tools that I needed for a project, and it just led to me feeling very frustrated and discouraged when I was trying to make a project. I used to think that they were just silly little frills that I didn't actually need. And in some ways I was right, because we don't need to have fancy stitch markers, although they're fun to have, and you also don't need decorative crochet hooks, which I actually really want one from Fox Jam Hooks, but they're not necessary. We do need to have the correct tools to be able to do our jobs though, and to do them well. I also realized that having the right tools was typically just a one-time purchase, and if I took care of those good quality items, they were going to last me for a very long time. Rule number 2 is that I've made time for crocheting and knitting almost every single day. The most obvious way that I've gotten better at crocheting and knitting is to practice, and I try to make time every day for a little bit of crocheting and or knitting. It's usually in the evening times after my day is done and we sit down as a family to watch some TV. That's when I have my little basket next to my chair and I'm able to crochet and knit in the evenings, and that is a very special time for me, and I try to do it almost every single day. Some days I only have about 10 minutes to work on something, and some days I might have a couple of hours. Now I am very careful to take breaks because I ended up up crocheting a whole lot in the beginning of my journey, and I ended up with pretty severe tendonitis, and I had to go through physical therapy. And I have a video all about how I dealt with the pain from crocheting and knitting, and I'll leave it in the description box below as well. But I've made sure to carve out that time for myself so that I can practice crocheting and knitting almost every day. My number one rule that has made me a better crocheter and knitter is to remember that comparison is a thief of joy. I used to be the kind of person who struggled with comparison, and I always compared what I was working on with what someone else was working on, and it led to so much dissatisfaction in my own projects that it did not motivate me to work on my crocheting and knitting skills. And I would beat myself up for not having the skills that other crocheters and knitters had, and all that led to was discouragement and disappointment, and it didn't help me to become a better crocheter and knitter. In fact, I think it actually did the opposite and made me a worse crocheter and knitter because I was constantly comparing myself to others. Then I heard this wonderful phrase, don't compare your beginning to someone else's middle. Or you could even apply, don't compare your middle to someone else's advanced skills. What it boiled down to for me was that I had only been crocheting and knitting for maybe a couple of years, but some of these people that I was trying to compare myself to had been crocheting and knitting for decades. How could I expect myself to be at the same level of someone who was an expert, who had spent countless hours on something when I was really at the beginning of my journey? I learned that this was not going to serve me well, and if I was going to have to compare myself to anyone, it was going to be to compare to my previous self. Looking at my projects from earlier in my journey and comparing them to my current projects is a motivator, because then I can see that I actually have made progress. As a crocheter and a knitter, we're making incremental improvements in our skills, and it's hard to see all at once. But if you look back at an earlier project, you'll likely be able to see all of those mistakes, and you'll be able to see how far you've actually come. I hope you found these 10 rules helpful for your situation, but please leave me some of your best tips and rules that you live by to help you to become a better crocheter and knitter. Stay safe out there and happy stitching.